A new legislative session is just about a month away. When you look ahead to it, what are your top priorities?
Great question, and thank you for being here to let us get the word out of what we plan to do. You know, the one thing that I think is going to be the most pressing issue as we all return back to the Gold Dome, we'll come back on January 13, is what do we do about hurricane relief for the victims of the communities and the families of Hurricane Helene. I have been down there multiple times and I've seen the devastation firsthand. And it is a generational devastation on families and communities. And the truth is, if the state doesn't step in and we don't provide some help and relief to those communities, you're going to have whole small communities that are simply not going to survive. I'm very grateful to Governor Kemp's effort on the front end to allocate $100 million in the form of relief. I think that's great. But when you look at the magnitude of this, we're talking about the devastation being 3 times the devastation of Hurricane Michael a few years earlier. So we're going to have to be creative and think about what do we do to get relief to those areas. And so I think you're going to see a lot of synergy around that and a sincere effort to try to get some help to those communities and families that have been so devastated.
So hurricane relief seems to be at the top of your list. What else is on your to-do list?
So, you know, one of the things we're going to work on and continue with the governor's leadership is continued tax relief for hardworking Georgians and families. We have worked hard on that with the governor's leadership, but also we've led in the Senate. And and was very pleased to see the governors and was happy to be at the announcement where the governor is going to plan to rebate tax income rebates of $1 billion in this next year, 2025 session. If you look at the cumulative effort of what we've done, Zach, you're looking at a $6 billion return of money to the hardworking folks of Georgia over the last 4 years, really in the form of income tax rebates like we just talked about, gas tax suspension, property tax rebates, which I think we were pretty creative on, and continuing the decrease of the actual income tax rate itself. You know, the money comes from folks that are all around Georgia and they send it to the Capitol. I happen to have a personal belief, as many conservatives do, that it's still their money. And I believe they know how to spend it better than we do. So the more of it we can send back home, the better off for the folks of Georgia. We're going to continue those efforts.
I think it's a good time to segue into something related. We're talking about finance, we're talking about money. The state has a very large surplus right now, right?
We do, yes.
It's about $16 billion.
12 to 16, depending upon what metrics you use to calculate, but it's a substantial sum of money, yes.
What's the plan to use that?
Well, I think we're going to look for the governor's leadership on that, as you very well understand the process and how the budgeting process works. But one of those, of course, is what we mentioned. That would be part of the source of returning money of the $1 billion and 25 of income tax rebates back to folks. I think we're also looking at, and again, I don't want to get ahead of the governor on this, but we're looking at it's important to look at efforts of where the state needs help and can spend those dollars in a way, I don't want to say necessarily just one-time use, but it's important not to create programs that then depend upon that for going forward, because we are seeing some economic headwinds. Georgia's in a better position, I think, than the rest of the country, and we're well positioned in the Southeast economically with our unemployment rates and the stability of our economy here in Georgia. But the truth is, we're going to see, and you're going to hear a lot, I suspect, as we come back to the Capitol, about some budget tightening as we come this year. So we've got to be real prudent in how we spend the money, try to return as much of it to the hardworking folks of Georgia as we can, but also think about those needs where we can address them while we do have an opportunity to do that.
And I know that the budgeting process and how a surplus is spent, that's a multi-factor process involving a lot of different constituencies throughout the state government and other folks across Georgia. But what for you would be a priority in terms of how to spend that money?
You know, I happen to think, as I think as a lot of conservatives do, that if we've got a stable business base and a good economy, and that the state is doing what it can to support that, folks that want jobs and have jobs, and we've got that condition here in Georgia, we need to maintain that. It takes investments or an investment mindset to continue to having a positive business environment. That's part of it. And speaking of that, that reminds me, if I can pivot back to one of the other priorities that I think you'll see a lot of discussion on coming up this year, is there is a resounding call for some sort of relief when it comes to tort relief, tort reform, or lawsuit abuse, depending on what you want to call it. I hear all the time, as do we do from around the state, of businesses that are suffering and closing the doors because they simply can't afford their insurance premiums. That shouldn't be the case. And so the governor has also spoken about this for really about 18 months now, and the thoughtful approach that he has taken to try to figure out why have we wound up with a very an anti-competitive environment in Georgia for insurance companies, meaning as a result of insurance companies leaving Georgia, you're seeing increased premium pressures on folks, whether it's their homeowner's policy or their automobile insurance, and certainly liability policies for business. So the governor said, well, let's look at the data that maybe are some of the drivers behind these increase in premiums. And so I was honored that he asked me to carry the tort data collection bill, which we had this past year.
You're an attorney in your private life, right?
I am, in my regular daytime job, I'm an attorney. And so that gives me a little bit of unique insight to seeing how the problems get manifest in the court system and in our civil justice system. And I think it's important to add and make sure that folks understand we're not talking about, and no one's advocating for, a wholesale landscape shift in our civil justice system. It just needs to be rebalanced in a small way because things have gotten out of balance. And when you see that we are for 11 years running the #1 state in which to do business, but we are for 2 years running the #1 state on the judicial hellhole list. That's not a name I came up with, but the judicial hellhole list. What you see are businesses that are being scared of, are they going to be able to continue to do business? Insurance rates going up, insurance companies leaving the state. Our folks in Georgia are paying for that. And so we've got to look at what is causing that, and that's part of the tort data collection bill that our insurance commissioner, John King, was tasked with the job of getting the information. He had a report, he's produced it as he did on November the 1st. We're all kind of looking at that to try to figure out what can we best glean from that. And I think you'll see the governor's office take the lead with, I hope, whether it's multiple bills or one bill that addresses these issues so that we can rebalance things so that businesses can continue to thrive in Georgia, so that doctors don't leave the state of Georgia because the malpractice premiums are so great that they will go to an adjacent state. We've just got to make sure we address this problem.
And as an attorney, I know that you'll understand, and there are some who might criticize a tort reform effort. As an attorney, you know that the civil justice system is designed to let people recover after they've been hurt or injured or damaged in some way. At the same time, you're pointing to situations where businesses, physicians, others are saying, look, our insurance premiums are too high. Those seem to be two competing interests. How do you balance them?
Well, you're right. It is a balance. And I'm glad you framed the question that way because it's very important for folks to understand. No one, I am certainly not, conservatives are not, and businesses are not advocating that folks ought not to be fairly compensated. Everyone agrees with that. And in fact, the governor had a round table. You may have covered some of the meetings. He had 4 meetings around the state of round table discussions, and some of which focused on certain segments. One was on the medical community, one was on manufacturing, and then there were 2 others. And everyone, from the people that are asking for this relief, the first thing they will say is, folks ought to be fairly compensated when they're injured or hurt or damaged, whatever the issue may be. No one's advocating for changing that. But it's got to be fair. It's got to be fair for everybody. And quite frankly, things have got imbalanced. And folks see that with the nuclear verdicts that we read about, where the numbers are such that an entire business sector is threatened because of one lawsuit or a series of lawsuits. And so that's what we're trying to look forward to addressing. So you're right, it's got to be balanced. Nobody's advocating for something that's lopsided. That's not what I want. That's not fair. That's not how I practice, and certainly not what our objective is as we come here to try to make laws and do what we do here at the Capitol.
And you've got a lot of issues and a lot of laws and topics that are top of mind in Georgia to make sense of as a legislator here. I want to talk to you about one issue that we've heard from voters and viewers a lot about: school safety. You know, Appalachia High School suffered a terrible, deadly school shooting earlier this year. The new legislative session is coming up. How do you intend to address school safety in that session?
Good question. I will tell you, I think that's also going to be top of mind of legislators as we come back. It's a horrible circumstance that we have all too often seen on the news, but it got visited here in Georgia in a very tragic way. And so I think what you will see is a continuation of the efforts to try to make sure that schools have the resources they need so that the children and parents, when they drop their children off, they know they're dropping their child off in a safe environment. We've been doing some things along those lines just in the past 2 years with additional resources. Right now, based on the budgeting and appropriations that we've had over the last year or two, each school has been given about $45,000 for them to spend. That's just in the last 18 months or so, and that continues in the future to decide how they need to implement school systems, whether it is additional safety resource officers or whether it's metal detectors. And I think, quite frankly, we need to look at maybe that number needs to be higher, and it's going to be a continued discussion. A couple of ideas that are coming forward that I think, some of which are very appealing, and that is I'm going to call them emergency badges or emergency buttons, where the school teachers and the personnel have a badge that we have similar to here, that they can press a button in the event of an emergency.
Effectively a panic button.
Exactly, and it is extremely effective and improves the resource and response time of first respondents coming in. And in fact, what happened at the school here in Georgia that was so tragic, fortunately, literally I think it was 1 week before, those panic button mechanisms had been deployed and facilitated there at the school. And I think that I understand from the school system and the first responders and the police, they're saying that greatly aided the folks being able to come in and contain that situation perhaps more quickly than they would have without.
So, and they had school resource officers there on campus as well.
Yes.
Do you wonder, though, we've been asked this as well, do you wonder, yes, panic buttons help, having a school resource officer or multiple SROs on campus helps, as was the case at Appalachia. They had these resources and still a terrible shooting happens. Are these ideas enough, or does more need to be done?
I think we need to be completely eyes wide open to seeing what can we do. And I promise you, we will be on the Senate side, as I think all legislators will be, interested in all ideas that may come forward. As I said a moment ago, nothing is more important than making sure our children have a safe school environment. The truth is, when parents drop their kids off at school today, it's a different environment and circumstance than when I drop my kids off at school every day. As we were talking earlier, my children are 28 and 26, and it's a different world. And we have to recognize that and be open to whatever ideas we can to make sure that we have a safe school environment and help the schools make those good, prudent decisions for what they need.
Your counterpart on the House side, Speaker John Burns, has talked about a package of legislation that seem to be at least somewhat open to some kinds of gun legislation reform. On the Senate side, and you personally as a legislator, are you open to considering legislation that might limit access to firearms in any way here in Georgia?
Well, when you talk about that, I guess the first answer for any proposed or an idea for legislation is any good legislator would want to read it and know what it says. So can't comment on it in the general sense. But I would tell you that I think if you look at the source of the problem that was there here in Georgia, you're talking about at its core mental health issues. And that child obviously had and has mental health issues. We are always looking forward to putting more resources there. And in fact, one of the things we've done over the last 2 years, of course, with House Bill 1013, and I'm proud to say Georgia has focused on mental health in a way we have not. And admittedly, we were behind the curve on trying to address mental health issues and resources for Georgians that have those needs. Other ways to address and create a greater safe environment is one of the things we did, again, I would tell you, I think the Senate leading on this, is with the firearm safety study committee that we had, of looking for ways of helping encourage folks to have safety mechanisms and having safe firearm storage, whether it's in their home or car or wherever it may be. We're going to continue to look for ways to do things like that. I think coming out of that study committee, we'll see. I don't know if legislation is going to be proposed. I was not on that committee, but there are things along those lines that we'll continue to be open to.
And that seems to track fairly closely with Speaker Burns' safe storage emphasis in his list of proposals as well. I want to be respectful of your time, ask you just a few more questions.
Sure.
If that's good with you.
Sure.
You represent Central Georgia.
I do.
We're sitting here in Atlanta. There are, in our state, there's one big city, big metro area in metro Atlanta. There are suburban and rural communities all throughout the rest of the state. How do you balance those different constituencies and needs as a legislator when you're crafting policy for the whole state?
You know, I'm glad you asked that question, because the vast majority of the population of Georgia, 2/3, are in the 4 central counties and what we think of the surrounding counties, the metro Atlanta area. But there's a great, big, beautiful state of rural areas and folks that grew up in small town areas, like my small town of Adrian, Georgia, of 800 people. And so I think, first of all, you have to come to this process with a mindset of understanding there's a large rural Georgia that, and admittedly, certainly for the economy of Georgia, as Atlanta goes, for the most part, so goes the economy of Georgia, and we appreciate that. But there's a lot of resources and good folks and a lot of things that rural Georgia does to contribute to the state of Georgia, the future of Georgia, and the economy of Georgia. And so I would tell you, maybe this is a bias or something I'm grateful to have, of having grown up in a small town and in rural Georgia. I understand what it's like to live there, and I understand what those needs are. I also lived in Atlanta for a while, so I think the experience of having both helps me. But to maybe more directly answer your question, folks that understand rural Georgia have to be a voice to put to people that come to Atlanta, that are from Atlanta, and say, hey, let me tell you what it's like in Southeast Georgia, Northeast Georgia, wherever it may be. And the more people know and understand what the rest of Georgia looks like and what those needs are, whether it's making sure we support the agricultural industry, making sure that we understand that the timber industry is so critically important for the state of Georgia, which is why the Hurricane Helene was so devastating to the state. I think it's an understanding of the state as a whole. And once that information is there, I'm pleasantly surprised at how most people go, I get it, we've got to think about Georgia as one big state when we pass laws.
And it's not just an economic division or geographic division. There are a lot of social and political divisions, region by region by region too. And not to put anybody in one singular box, but many of the more rural and more suburban places in our state are more conservative. Many of the larger metro areas lean more Democratic. One issue that I think is worth ending on here, and it comes out of the House as well. Speaker John Burns recently, talking about social issues and political issues, Speaker John Burns voiced his support for legislation keeping transgender girls out of women's sports here in Georgia. Do you support that?
I do, and I think you'll see our caucus is very supportive of that. We've had some legislation on our side, and I think if that issue in the form of legislation, either proposed from the Republican side or from the left side, I think you're going to see a good common sense approach. And to me, Zach, it really boils down to the fairness of, for example, young girls being asked or forced to compete against biological males, whether it's in swimming or track or whatever it may be. I think most folks understand and get there's just a fundamental unfairness of that. And it's to the girls, many of whom have spent months or years of their life preparing for a sport they love, and they wind up in a competition where it's not fair. The field is not level because they wind up competing against someone that's a biological male, and that's not fair. And our issue, and I think we see it as one of fundamental fairness. So yes, I do agree with how you've characterized Speaker Burns' view of that issue, and I think if it comes our way, you'll see us take a common sense approach that reflects Georgia values in that regard.
That would impact high schoolers and younger as well in Georgia, right?
I think it would. Again, I haven't seen the legislation, so I don't know the details. Yeah.
Can you point to any instances in Georgia where a high school athlete has had a problem with a transgender girl in their sport?
I can tell you I had a constituent talk about her granddaughter who was at a swim meet, who had literally prepared, that was the sport she loved, and at the high school level finds herself in a competition against a biological male. And to say it wasn't fair doesn't even fully sort of understand the issue. So yes, it does get visited on young girls in a way that's simply not fair.
Senator, is there anything I missed that you think is important that you want us to hear?
No, I think you've asked some great questions. I appreciate the time to get to be with you. And I think I'll add one other thing that's of keen interest to me, if I may.
Please,
take just
yeah,
a moment.
Please.
Yeah, something that's gotten my attention, and that is we have worked really hard over the last few years. And if you look at the arc of how we've worked for education and trying to make sure that school kids of this state have the best opportunity for a successful future, that was first seen through the graduation rates, which you saw a lot of school systems focus on in the last 12 to 15 years. And then we realized that we had a problem with literacy rates. And some leaders on my side, senators that recognized it, and for the last 2 years we passed some good legislation for Literacy Council and additional funding for children to make sure that they can graduate and have those basic literacy skills. What we're now looking at is the problem with chronic absenteeism in school.
Did that pick up during COVID?
It certainly did. If you look at the numbers pre-COVID, it was a little under 10%. For the most recent year, we're looking at 21% absenteeism rate for public school system in Georgia. And 21% doesn't tell you the real number. That number equates to 360,000 school kids in Georgia that are chronically absent, which is generally thought of meaning they're missing 10% or more of the school days that they need to be in school. Zach, kids can't be successful if they're not attending school. They're never going to get to the literacy rate if they're not attending, and they certainly have no hope of graduating. That's something we're going to be focusing on. I'm very concerned about it, and I think you're going to see us rolling up our sleeves and trying to understand the issue and trying to find solutions. Thank you for asking.
Senator, thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.